All right. Let everybody enter the webinar. Hello, my name is Chris, and I'm the events coordinator at Powerhouse Arena. And tonight we are thrilled to be hosting the launch for Tomboy by Lisa Selen Davis. Thank you everyone for coming. You'll be able to ask questions through the Q&A function on your screen throughout the event, and Lisa will take them at the end. You can also buy the book at powerhousebookstores.com. The link is in the event page, and I will post it again right now in the chat. Lisa will be in conversation with Lauren Sandler, and I will introduce them now. Lauren Sandler is an award-winning journalist based in Brooklyn and the author of This Is All I Got, A New Mother's Search for Home, One and Only, The Freedom of Having an Only Child and the Joy of Being One, and Righteous, Dispatches from the Evangelical Youth Movement. Lauren's essays and features have appeared in dozens of publications, and she has been on staff at Selen and at NPR. Lisa Selen Davis is the author of the novels Lost Stars and Belly, and is an essayist and journalist who has written for major publications such as the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Guardian, Time, Yahoo, and Salon, among many others. She lives with her family in New York. And I will hand it over now.
Thanks, Chris. Hi, everyone. I'm so glad that you joined us for this launch of this book that I have just been waiting for since the book deal was announced, to be perfectly honest. There's so many conversations I've had about this book, just imagining what it would be, and then getting to read it in process was something that obsessed me. And now here it is, this actual book, this book that I think many of us have been waiting for in many ways, whether it is because we think about how childhood is insanely gendered, or how the sort of tomboy attitudes of our Gen X past seem to have vanished in this world of princesses, or how we think about raising our own kids as they experiment with gender, and how that relates to ongoing conversations about sexuality, about identity, about medicalization. And the person I have most loved having conversations about pretty much all of those topics with has been Lisa through this time, and now I get to do it in front of you. So Lisa, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this launch with you, and congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you, Lauren, for your help all along the way, your hand-holding, your insight, and your brilliance.
Well, so starting with the word tomboy, because that, of course, is the title of the book and the thread throughout the whole book. Let's talk about the complicated past of that word, because I think that when people think about language and the complications of language around gender and identity, we think about pronouns. But in fact, it's not just pronouns that have complications. There's this word that I think tends to be, feel naive in some ways. And you really talk about the history and complications of this word.
Yeah, I started out with the first question was, wait, what is a tomboy? Because when it came back into my life was when someone told my daughter she was one, and the explanation was that's a girl who likes short hair and plays sports. And then that's kind of what rattled me, where I thought, oh, didn't that describe most people I grew up with, who we all had short hair? And I didn't play sports, but I was around girls who played sports. So the first question was not just where did that word come from, but how do you define what a tomboy is, and how does it change over time? And it started as a word that meant a boisterous boy, then it became a word that meant a lascivious kind of slutty woman, and then it meant a misbehaving girl who acted like a boy, and finally it became a term of pride and a compliment. And then it became what it is now, which is mostly obsolete.
It's funny, I'm hearing you talk about the short hair. It's reminding me of my own short haircut. And, I only wore primary color turtlenecks and Oshkosh bagosh. And when I remember when I got my first inhaler, because I have asthma, it didn't say Lauren Sandler on it. It said Warren Sandler on it because they couldn't believe at, the CVS that, that I could actually be a Lauren looking the way that I looked. And yet at the same time, it was the 70s and everyone looked that way. I think a lot about the Lego ad that got a lot of play when it was resurrected several years ago, which, comes up. And there's so much material in your book about how we advertise to kids and what feels normative now versus then. Does it feel like we never even needed to have a word for it and now we do, but we're not even using it?
Well, that's a really good question. In the beginning of it becoming a positive term that was the 19th century, and that's when the common school movement started, and kids were starting to have childhoods for the first time instead of either working or playing their role if they were upper class. And they were just having this new time and space with playing and learning, and these books started being published to tell children how to behave. And that's when the word tomboy becomes more popular and more popular usage. And then we start having tomboy literature with, the most famous one being Little Women. And from the beginning then of those books that explain how to behave and what's normal and what's not is a word for girls who are acting more like boys. So every time we divided stuff into here's what boys do and here's what girls do, there were always girls who were not complying with those rules. And I think a lot of people believe that today, we did all this work. First we had feminism and we had tomboy heyday, and then we had girl power, and now girls can be anything they want to be. And they're actually pretty unaware that the messages about what's for girls and what's for boys, what they're supposed to look like, what their toys should be, what are their normal personality traits, that actually it's gotten narrower and narrower in the last 30 years.
One of the things that drives me crazy is girls wearing t-shirts that say girls can do anything. Because when have we ever seen a boy wearing a t-shirt that says boys can do anything? It's just the dinosaur, because of course you can be a paleontologist, or
right.
Football, because of course you can be a football player. For girls, it's this notion, which is such sloganeering that to me often feels like it goes against the purpose. And it also feels like just another way to sell a disposable t-shirt. Can you talk to us a little bit about how it feels like gender is sold and commodified?
Yeah, so, the beginning of gendering kids' clothes is 100 years ago, around 1920. And that project really started when psychologists and sexologists started to classify homosexuals as a different strain of person, not someone engaging in an act, but a kind of person. And the prevailing ideology was that homosexuals were created by nurture, that it was not biological. And so before that, kids were all wearing the same thing, young kids. They all wore dresses. Little babies wore white dresses, and older kids wore, until they went to school, wore dresses of different colors, and they mostly all had long hair until they were 6 or 7 and went to school. And then slowly their lives, their appearances would become more gendered. But once these ideas started permeating the culture that you could make a kid gay by letting him access what's feminine, parents and child psychologists were kind of new, and they were advising, strip all that stuff away from your little boy and teach him early how to be a man by putting him in little masculine clothing, and no more flowers and no more lace. Pink wasn't part of that then. But really teach him early through his clothes and his toys how to be a straight man. So today, when you're dressing your little boy only in boys' clothes and won't put any girls' clothes on them, that is rooted entirely in homophobia and making sure he knows how to be straight. And now, these days, also how to be cis. And that project of gendering childhood, the stuff of childhood, it goes in waves, and the waves are usually connected to the economy. So what's fascinating is that anytime there's a recession, we get more gendering, because the more you divide stuff into pink and blue for boys and girls, the more people can't have hand-me-downs. So it picks up again later in the 70s as there's a recession. And if we can't share, if we have pink and blue, if you have to buy a new stroller because your first one is pink, then you have to buy 2 of everything. So it's a reaction to the declining birth rate and to recession. And then the lesson to marketers is like, holy cow, this works so well. So, and people believe now that it's biological and natural, and they fall for it and they participate in it. And it's gotten to the point, as many of us know now, I mean, we look back and think, why did we all have an orange and blue big wheel, or whatever color it was? Everybody had the same one, and now there's the boys, and then there's the Princess Pink girls, but it's with almost everything you could ever think of. It's with like M&Ms and pens.
And so then what happens if a boy wants a pink big wheel or a girl wants a blue big wheel? What's the response to that?
Well, that's a great question, because when we were familiar with tomboys as a trope, and even encouraging girls to reach over to the blue side as we were in the 70s, then we were just like, that's cool. She's doing it. She can have anything that's on the boy side, right? We never opened up the pink side to boys. And we also sent the message through all these variations that the pink stuff was not good. So a lot of the 1970s tomboy heyday, feminist style parenting, which was called non-sexist parenting, but it was actually saying, reject all the girly stuff, and telling boys and girls to do that. So we haven't yet gotten to the point where we say, you know what, we divided this stuff up somewhat arbitrarily into pink and blue. There's great stuff on both sides, and everyone should have access to it, which is my argument and my passion. So I think what we do now, certainly what I did initially when my kid wasn't lining up the way I expected her to, is to like freak out. I think that's the first thing, and say, what's wrong? What's happening? Instead of saying, where did I get the idea that my kid should only like certain colors and certain toys and certain kinds of clothes and certain playmates? What line did I buy that says my child should be limited like that? So now I realize that that reaction of confusion or worry is totally unnecessary. And you know what you should do is be psyched.
And it's interesting because then I think the woke cultural noise around it is like, oh, that's so great that you have a gender non-conforming child, which is complicated, right? Will you talk to us about that language?
Yeah. So there are 2 camps of people who hate the word tomboy, but I find almost no one who likes it. So one camp are...
Can I just say for the record, like, even having read your book, having talked to you about this, knowing it's really prickly past, I have to say, I'm really struggling with giving up the word tomboy. Because to me, and I know this is something that you write about and that we share, and there are probably plenty of people who have joined us who share this too, like, I idolized tomboys. I wanted to be Joe. I knew exactly who my favorite girl on Facts of Life was. I mean, like, none of these things were ever in question. And to me, that was the coolest thing. That was the thing that felt like the receptacle for my own burgeoning politics. And even if it wasn't fully my identity, even if I wasn't quite as, you know, if my knees weren't quite as skinned, or if I still liked to dress once in a while, I still saw myself as like reaching for that all the time. Like, you know, loving Blair, hating Joe, that was my binary. And so on Facts of Life. And so I have to say that I have such a deep nostalgia for it. And I feel like in your book, there's this element that comes through, which is both how problematic it is. And there are people, you know, you speak to people who grew up as tomboys who are lesbians and people who grew up as tomboys who aren't. And, you know, historians and thinkers around this issue. And yes, there is so much tomboy resistance, but I feel like and maybe this is just part of my own privilege as a cis straight woman who can get to think critically about a word but still have nostalgic affection for it, which is probably problematic as hell. I just want to say I'm having a hard time giving up my affection for it.
I don't think you have to. Aren't we in the age where you can choose your word that feels comfortable for you and claim it proudly? I don't know.
I don't know.
It's interesting because there are a lot of people who resent the word tomboy when they're young. They resent people affixing it to them. And there are a lot of parents who resent that word being affixed to their child. But then they look back nostalgically on their childhoods and say, I was a tomboy. I mean, which honestly, I think 90% of women I talk to about this book say I was a tomboy. I feel like I'm one of the only ones, like I was not in any way a tomboy, though briefly I looked like one because everyone was dressed like little boys. So it's a word that a lot of...
Is gender nonconforming the new appropriate word for tomboy?
Okay, so I'll tell you about the two camps. So, and you'll see articles arguing both these things. So there are a bunch of articles in the past 5 years from mothers saying, stop calling my daughter a tomboy, it's sexist. And they're saying that by using a word with the word boy in it, when for a girl who is sporty and confident, outspoken, and rejecting traditional femininity, that just reinforces the idea that that stuff is for boys. Just call her a girl. Mm-hmm. Then you get people saying tomboy is an oppressive word, especially for some trans men who are told over and over again, you're just a tomboy, you're just a tomboy. It's a phase, or you're still a girl, or et cetera, and who feel like gender nonconforming is the liberating word. But it's also a word that many parents use to describe a kid who is simply not acting the way you thought that kid was going to act based on their body parts, really just their genitals, just what the doctor or midwife said when the baby came out and you found out the sex, unless you found it before. And then without you even knowing it, you rolled out a list of expectations and your kid isn't doing it. Oh, my kid doesn't like pink and princess and sparkles and rainbows. Do you need a special name for someone doing that? Or does that, or is that actually doing it even more, saying you can't be a girl and like those things? I have more questions than I do answers, but I think the tension around whether we need to name non-conforming behavior or not, what we need to label and what we need to just make space for by not labeling it is what I'm interested in.
Hear, hear. I am interested in how parents who may self-identify as progressive may be complicit in a lot of what you're talking about. Because I think that plenty of us know people who have a lot of pride in trumpeting the fact that their 3-year-old boy wants to put on a tutu for a few months, and then there's a category. And sometimes that means they're listening to that child, and that child is expressing itself. And sometimes I think it's, you know, this real rush into embracing and defining something that a kid hasn't even begun to define for itself yet. And I think that this can go all over the map. A lot of this, I think, is related to what you're talking about in terms of the capitalist relationship with gender, where these are the products. Pick your product, kid. And when you pick your product, you then picking your identity for the rest of your life. And whether you will be accepted or hated by one group of people or another group of people because you reached for the pink tricycle. And I think that it's really complicated for a lot of parents who want to support and encourage by any means necessary. But I do wonder if at times that becomes a new way of making strictly gendered categories, if in a sort of non-conforming sense.
Yeah, I mean, those are important questions to be asking. Who gets liberated by these definitions and who gets limited? And how do we balance those things? And who's aware of their participation? And I certainly, I vaguely knew about that pink wasn't always for girls. I knew.
Will you tell us about that? Because I find that people are always stunned when they actually hear about the history of pink and blue.
Well, I guess I have figured everyone knew it already because Peggy Orenstein had written about it, but maybe not everyone is just drooling over everything Peggy Orenstein writes like I am. So, I mean, they probably are, but yeah, there are two there's a sociologist and a historian who've done really important work in the gendering of children's material worlds. So Joe Paoletti is a historian who asked this question, which apparently no one had asked, which is, where did the pink blue thing come from? And there's a sociologist named Elizabeth Sweet who asked, where did the gendering, why do we have boys' toys and girls' toys? And their research turned up very similar things, that the homophobia we talked about and the changes in the economy. So pink was a hard color to produce in the 19th century, and then it became more common. But there was debate about, as we started to have ideas that there should be boy clothes and girl clothes, nobody knew where pink belonged. Pink was part of red, and red was thought of as dominant and masculine. So for a long time, people thought pink was a man's color. And also the department stores that were kind of setting out the norms for their communities. Each department store had a different idea. So there was like, Marshall Field's and Filene's that said one thing and Macy's that said one thing. So there was no set division of blue is for boy and pink is for girl, because baby blue was associated with the Virgin Mary. So that was considered a girlish color. So those ideas were being worked out. And some people think what sealed the deal for pink being associated with girls was Mamie Eisenhower, who was famously obsessed with pink. And those pink mid-century bathrooms, which I personally really love, are called Mamie pink bathrooms. And so some of that, and then as the consumer culture of the 50s grew, there was more like infusing pink into women's items and really making it part of identity. And of course, in order for stuff to be part of our identity, we need to have money to buy stuff to promote our identities. So that's why it's also connected. Like the more we are able to produce stuff that has identity infused into it, the more color becomes part of that.
I mean, I can't help but think about how the mid-century also represents this period of time in which patriarchy really was depending on women to play women's roles, and women were sort of thinking, I'm not so sure about that. So I think it's really interesting in terms of all of this commercialism, how much that really solidifies at that time, and how much, not that gender identity wasn't something that was really present before then, but how gender identity solidifies in, I think, new suburban American kind of ways.
Yeah, and also really needing, women after being Rosie the Riveters and taking on men's roles, and of course realizing like, I actually can do all this stuff, and many of them thinking I actually really like doing this stuff, then being forced back into that domestic role and the kind of creation of the ideal of the housewife, and all of that is to push women back into their corner. And it's also why I think women's clothes in the 50s got very, very feminine again, with those super tiny waisted dresses that flare out like that, and then when we get feminism, a lot of that it's like a mini version of the corset, right? It's like, let me go back. You're a feminine person and you should partake of feminine activities in the domestic sphere. We let them out and we have to try to put them back. And what happens each time, though, is that those women who have a taste of feminism tend to raise their children differently. So a lot of those housewives in the 50s and early 60s, their children go on to be, the members of the women's movement who reject all that.
The history that you've just given us is essential, I think. I also know from reading, not just the book, but your recent essay, that there's a racial dynamic to this history too, specifically as it relates to the word tomboy. And I was hoping that you could talk us through that a little bit.
Yeah, I was putting that out on social media as like part of the surprise in the subtitle is the racist history of tomboyism. And then I was like, well, there are a lot of people who will not be surprised that, yet some other part of American history is incredibly racist. So that history is about in the mid-19th century as the birth rate starts declining among American-born whites. And that Victorian era of like really prizing frailty in women and keeping them in the domestic sphere, the cult of true womanhood and the cult of domesticity, and really siphoning them off in their own spheres. And there interesting things happened in those spheres, which many people have written about, including lots of romantic love and little side businesses, and women's magazines even kind of come out of that, even though they're, they don't have any freedom, but secretly they're kind of putting worlds together. But their clothes for middle class and upper class white women are very, very restrictive, and having a life with no physical activity is not good for you, it turns out. So, they were not healthy, and the birth rate was declining, and immigration was increasing. So there was a real panic among white people that we needed to make more white babies. And tomboyism is already this idea that's circulating through the kid lit and through the school, and becoming more popular and less punitive. And there start to be articles in the press saying we should really be raising girls as tomboys. It's the healthiest way to grow up. But within those messages, it's really about let them be tomboys and climb trees and play baseball and run around so that when they hit puberty, they can make white babies. And so all of those articles about how you should raise your children, your daughters as tomboys, always make it known that that phase should end at puberty. And that idea has continued for a long time, that tomboyism is a phase and it has to end.
So one of the things that I find most fascinating about your book is the way that it approaches puberty as a real pivot, right? In terms of the prepubescent childhood identity related to body and desire. And then what happens when that pivot turns. And I really want to talk about that. And you already mentioned, the sort of medicalization of nonconformity in some way, like you come into this world with a penis or a vagina, and is that
or a little
appendage or lack thereof?
Yeah.
To get unnecessarily Freudian about it, is that going to determine the scope of your personality and desires in so many ways? And I'd love you to talk about that medicalizing of conformity and nonconformity, both around kids, but then also what happens when those bodies start changing.
Well, even more than the medicalizing, I think it's the pathologizing, the idea that there is something wrong, perhaps something clinically wrong with your child, again, not doing what you thought they were going to do when you looked at their genitals. Like, if we think about it in those terms, it's somewhat absurd. What are those body parts a predictor of? They're a predictor of how we're going to treat our children and how strangers are going to treat our children and how we're going to limit them and how we're going to assemble their toys and what we're going to encourage them to do. And I don't know what they're an indicator of beyond that, because There are all these different kinds of people doing femininity and masculinity, or neither or both, in all of these different ways. Some of them coming from what feels like a very biological place, this is just who I am. Others either complying with their cultures or rejecting their cultures, or having a different relationship as they age. So I think it's interesting how many people find it a problem when their child isn't conforming and feel they need to get some kind of intervention. I'm not talking about kids who are in real distress, who have gender dysphoria, trans kids who are sure of themselves, and I address that a lot, but that's not really the population I'm talking about, because a lot of these people I'm talking about are really quite happy and comfortable. It's the adults who are uncomfortable. And what happened at puberty is that a lot of those kids who had incredibly happy, confident, comfortable childhoods had a very hard time. Ranging from straight cisgender women to trans men, or non-binary people, or butch lesbians, and everyone in between. Not too many of the people I talk to breezed through puberty. That said, I don't know how many people out there breeze through puberty. It's horrible. But they all had control over how they were perceived. So they could run around as a boy, look like a boy. Most of them enjoyed when people thought they were boys, didn't correct people. Sometimes they felt like proud to be girls and intervened, but they were having these tomboy childhoods where they occupied a kind of what I called a protective bubble of ambiguity, just like they knew who they were and maybe other people didn't, and they were comfortable in there. And then puberty happens to them and they're not in control of that anymore. And not only do they not have a body that they necessarily want, but people treat them differently. And of course, I've seen this with my kid which I write about in the book, she grew her hair out, people started treating her like a girl, and it was bananas, like just night and day. Totally different kind of human being, different human interaction, different assumptions from people. And people have no idea that they're doing that they really talk to a child completely differently based on what they assume the child's sex is. So, some of the people I talk to have physically transitioned and they're very happy. And some of the people are older and that wasn't an option. And it was very hard for them, but they're happy that it wasn't an option because they settled into a place of comfort. Some people never needed any intervention and they were fine. It was weird for a while. They got used to it. Turns out they like, the occasional dress. There was a huge spectrum of experiences. What they had in common was a kind of freedom in childhood, varying levels of difficulty in puberty, and a lot of self-confidence as adults. But how they expressed their identities, what they did, how much they medicalized their experience, it ran the gamut.
How can those of us raising kids support them through that process? Because I think there is an element of having a child, a young child, where it's like, it can be for some of us not that complicated to say, yeah, great, wear a tutu today, and we're nothing but jeans next year every single day, and cut your hair short, grow it long, whatever. Go through your phases of this. If you have the one thing that feels like you, we're all behind that. If you switch it up, that's cool too. Like that degree of flexibility with a kid who is openly expressing these things, openly expressing desires, frustrations, you name it, that feels like, okay, that's something that I think parents can handle doing, and all parents should be able to handle doing, right? It's interesting to think about what it means to have a pubescent kid, though, where all of a sudden it's like, I'm shutting myself away, I'm shutting you out, this is painful, you don't get it, and I'm not giving you any clues. And I wonder how, you know, anyone who's parenting a kid who doesn't live at a gender extreme, which to me, like, that's all gender is there are some people who live at these poles, and I'm always wondering why. And then there's everyone else. And how do you think about how we think about puberty for kids who are in the middle?
Well,
And you can say you don't know, because I know
I'm terrified of it, and
I know it's not answered in
part
the
of my
book,
life yet. I think more about my own puberty as a woman in my late 40s going through perimenopause, and like the bizarreness of my child about to enter this phase of massive hormonal mix-up while I'm in the middle of one myself, and how crazy that is.
It's a trip.
It's a trip.
Let me tell you.
Well, I wanted to say that the thing that almost everyone I interviewed mentioned was the moment that their mothers sat them down and said, you can't run around without a shirt anymore. Oh. And that stood out, all of these people, that moment crystallized, that was the end. That was the protective bubble of ambiguity popped. And although it is legal, you know, in New York anyway, for women to be topless anywhere a man can be topless, very few parents are letting their girls, once they hit puberty, run around without their shirts off. So my message is that your body is just your body. It's going to change. It's going to change your whole life. Wait till you get older, and it's going to change in all kinds of ways that you did also. I didn't sign up for any of this either. Which is not to say that that has nothing to do with the people who need to transition and they, you know, go for it and do it. I'm not talking about that population. I'm talking about, you know, the other 99% of the population. My message is your gender expression, if we want to call that, or your way of being in the world does not have to change because your body changed. You don't have to dress differently. You don't have to behave differently. You don't have to hang out with different people. Puberty is hard. It's especially hard for girls. You know, it's not fun to have your period. And it can be really cumbersome for these girls who've run around shirtless to have breasts. And I take the medicalization very seriously. I think, you know, I don't have a lot to say about the people, you know, I haven't had the experience of having a trans kid with gender dysphoria who needs to transition and it works. And I support those people and don't want to interrupt their message. But I do think we can say to most children, this is going to be hard and it doesn't have to change who you are or how you are in the world.
Mm-hmm. It sucks that it's so hard for so many people to say that to their own kids. It makes me sad for everyone. You know, I think about how we gender childhood, and it's just one of the things that makes me incredibly angry a lot, as you know. And we seem to be doing it more and more, which as people also seem to be more and more aware of things. I mean, one of the things that you've said before, mentioned it just on the phone today, is like how for kids, we have two genders, right? And on Facebook, there are 71 different gender identities. And during this one, you know, during the earlier phase of life, when it seems like, why would there ever be any gender identity if it wasn't, you know, like if a kid is playing with it, fine. But the notion that there's a binary for pre-sexual children, even medicalized sex, it doesn't make, I don't know, I puzzle over this extensively. I feel like it's just a game of telling people who they can't be and what they should buy. And I think there's so much pain that comes with it. And I know that that is not how everyone feels, that there's a lot of pleasure that comes with it for some people too. And obviously you can see, like, I have long hair, I'm wearing lipstick, I entertain these things myself, but I do think that there was something really powerful, as you pointed out, of like, being the kid who had Warren on her inhaler, being the kid with the bowl cut, and the Oshkosh, where choices do get to feel like choices for me. And I know that one of the things that you've written about is the confidence that comes with being the girl who runs around with, you know, her shirt off when she's a kid, or, you know, doesn't go for the princess Barbie set. That's redundant, but will you talk a little bit about like just the incredible positivity that comes from raising girls outside of the castle
and boys outside of the sports arena, or whatever that equivalent is?
Yeah,
I mean, I started this knowing nothing, and I wasn't a tomboy. I mean, I feel like I was raised hardcore feminist, but I just wasn't interested, and I really, you know, I really wanted a Gunny Sacks dress, which was like the big thing when I was little, but they were very expensive. And but I did love Joe, and so I didn't know what I would find. And so one of the things that surprised me was just like the amount of self-confidence that all of these different people had, regardless of their identity or how much struggle they had. And a lot of them went on to work in male-dominated fields. And I wasn't able to get at exactly why that was. I mean, some of it is they were comfortable around men because they'd been around boys as a kid. They might have absorbed some of the male privilege from playing with those groups and being treated in a certain way. You know, when everyone calls my daughter Buddy everywhere we go, and there's an assumption in that of you're my peer, as opposed to the kind of like sweetie that a girl would get, which is sort of like a diminutive and, you know, less than. So it turns out that the research on people who reject gender norms, we could call them gender nonconforming, but we still have to talk about, is that about identity or behavior? But either way, people who are not abiding the pink-blue divide kids turn out to be generally, new research came out that they do better in school. They're more academically successful. They tend to be more creative, and they tend to be more psychologically healthy. And it's pretty clear why that is, because the more we divide it into masculine and feminine, into this is boy stuff and this is girl stuff, the less kids feel that they can access what's on either side. And because there are skill sets and personality traits included in that, it's really hard for a kid. It's really hard for a boy who wants the pink princess thing, but also is one of those like nice, sweet, kind boys who I love so much, you know, and maybe isn't interested in sports and isn't, you know, and we're telling him like, well, but this is what boys do. When the truth is, these are human personality traits. These are human activities and human toys. So the most psychologically healthy people are going to be people who can pull from both sides of that artificial divide.
I'm wondering what it was like for you listening to you talk about this, to be reporting and writing about something which is outside of your own identity, as someone who didn't self-identify as a tomboy and isn't, you know, the embodiment of one as an adult. And certainly you're coming from a place of parenthood, which I want to talk about right before we go to questions. But did it feel complicated to be Lisa writing about this?
I mean, I feel like that's my job. And I think it's the best part of my job. And, you know, my first novel was about a 59-year-old white Catholic kind of bigot in upstate New York. So I really related to him, and I actually enjoyed inhabiting his mind. But I don't have anything in common with him other than a big ego, which turns out to be enough. So I feel like that's the point of journalism and fiction. And, you know, we're in this kind of own voices movement, which I respect and think is very important, but I still think that there's a place for these kind of larger analyses and from a different perspective, as long as I acknowledge my own perspective and where I'm coming from. But I will say I also was raised in it with the idea that there's a gender binary, there are boys and girls, and I was raised with the idea that those are biological and not social categories, which many people today are veering away from. So I'm aware of how I was raised and how it affects how I see the world, but I really, really, really wanted to understand people who saw the world and saw gender differently than I did. And especially the people some of whom were shaming me or trying to cancel me on Twitter, which I hadn't experienced before. So I felt like, well, either I can cower in the corner, which I did for a while, or I can reach out to some of those people and say, do you want to get together for coffee and explain your point of view to me? Because I just didn't even know that was a way to see the world. Mm-hmm. And spent like a lot of the book trying to keep their perspective in my mind as I wrote, even though I still stand by my original thesis, like 100%. But that experience of looking at the world through another perspective is the best part of this job, and like kind of the best part of being human. Like, what a great thing to be able to do, but we are living in our little silos, and then people write books that are just like an argument, and then they just weed out, like lawyers, oh, this interrupts my argument, so I'm not going to put it in. And I really didn't want to do that. I wanted to say, like, here's what I think and what I believe. Here's what somebody else thinks and believes. How do we synthesize these disparate ideas about gender? I don't know that we can, but we certainly can respect that both of our ideas are legitimate.
So this is a way of pivoting to questions, but also sort of, the obvious question here. What did make you so interested in writing this book and exploring the history of the word tomboy, as one of our anonymous questioners asks? What was the way in for you?
Well, I had originally written something when my kid was like 3 or 4 for a parenting magazine, and it was all about just her rejecting traditional gender norms and my feelings about that. And I would say that there were not really any conversations about trans kids in the media then, and there also weren't a lot of conversations about, are you writing about your kids in ways that you're not thinking about the lasting impact of that, which is a constant conversation now. So I was pretty blindly just like doing what I do, which is having strong feelings about something and writing about it. And then as the years went by and we had come to understand our child, but there were all these adults in her life not understanding them. And I felt, and we were like at this moment that I now recognize as, on the one hand, 72, or however many gender identity options, and this massive expanse and exploding of the binary, and yet the complete disappearance of a kind of masculine girl who was so common in my childhood. And it was like that combination of those things, coupled with the criticism I received and the like trying to just understand the criticism, that alerted me to the fact that this was a big, rich, important subject. But I think I worked on the proposal. It took me a very long time because I was very, very scared of being canceled, and I didn't really know what it meant. And I also felt like, as a person in my 40s, I wasn't raised on like, I'm typing this thing and I don't mean it at all. So I'm threatening you on Twitter and saying, let's find out, it says she lives in Brooklyn, let's go find her. I don't know if that's real or not. So I just wasn't, I was really afraid of that. And I also didn't want to write anything that would make vulnerable populations more vulnerable. I wanted to do something that would create more understanding and tolerance, which I had really tried to do.
Dave Ahrens has a question which is about the more personal side of what you just described, which is, he was wondering, can you tell us about how you feel about how the life of your kid led you down a path that you never expected to go, and how much you had to change and learn and grow and ultimately be rewarded for honoring the autonomous life of your child?
What a beautifully worded question from one of the greatest people in the whole world, Dave Aarons. I mean, I think my kids are watching, but maybe they've gotten bored and hopped off. I really hope so. You know, I think at one point I had in the introduction that this was a morally murky undertaking. And some of my friends said, who read it, were like, you got to take that out. Don't cancel yourself preemptively. But I feel, you know, I did try to write about my kids very minimally in this book. They're really the launch pad for this much bigger investigation into the history and culture and biology. But I do feel like, I guess I just admire my kids so much, and they are so much happier than I was as a child and so much more confident. And what I learned more than anything to do with my older child, who we you know, the tomboy, I actually learned much more about how to support my younger child, who is much more conforming and loves makeup. And I can't remember what else she loves that's so conforming by makeup, but she loves fashion. She has a wonderful fashion style. And it was harder for me to relate to that. And it was harder for me to support that. But so much of the research was about the devaluing of things that are marked as feminine, even if they're randomly marked as feminine, like rainbows and pink, right? Like that stuff is, there's nothing biological about that. That's just stuff. But we mark it feminine, we say it's girly, and then we say it's bad. And so I think what I really learned was that I didn't want to participate in that. And so we have decided in our house that none of these material objects have genders or gender references. And I think you can just decide not to participate. So everybody wears pink in our house. And we don't look down on something because it's marked as for girls. And that actually affected my parenting more than anything else, was that research about how girls learn to internalize sexism and how boys learn to practice it.
Which I have to add is something that you write about a lot in the book, and I feel deeply reading it. And I'm saying that to the person who wrote the question, why should parents raising kids who fit neatly into the gender boxes read this book? But I also think that that's something that you might want to speak to even more. You know, if you have a child who is neatly, you know, a male identifying or female identifying, even that language, behaving, you name it, a pink blue childhood, let's say, what would a parent of a kid like that gain from your beautiful yellow book?
Well, all the research around, all the discussion around toxic masculinity, which replaced a discussion about girls' low self-esteem and lack of achievement in STEM, you know, all of that stuff is about gender norms. And the research about gender nonconforming children is that they're more successful. So my argument is we should really push our kids not to conform, because gender norms and gender stereotypes are harmful. And there's a mountain of psychological research about that. So just because your kid isn't distressed by abiding the pink-blue divide doesn't mean that you should live by it. And, you know, we can work really hard to change the culture, and we can certainly change the messaging we give our kids about what is for boys and what is for girls. And also, if you have a kid who's fitting neatly into that, chances are your kid is doing a certain amount of policing of other kids who aren't. So kids who are gender nonconforming tend to be, and trans kids also tend to be, much more accepting of kids who don't conform in a whole host of ways. So it's because we have gendered so much of their worlds, it's just keeping them from so much healthy psychological development. And that is where these endless discussions that go from girl crisis to boy crisis, we just cycle in between them.
So someone else is wondering if your book delves into the rejection of gender in general.
I get the rejection of gender in general.
Mm-hmm.
I guess you mean people who identify as agender or something?
I don't know.
No.
We have to hear from the anonymous asker.
Oh, the anonymous asker.
But it's in the context of someone who's heard of a couple that is raising their child to not associate with any gender.
Yeah, so I profile a woman who's doing that, a sociologist named Kyle Meyer. She might be, I don't know if she's on here. She has a child named Zoomer, and they live in Salt Lake City, and her book is coming out in a month. And Zoomer has I hope it's okay for me. I think Kyle won't mind, but Zoomer is raised with like even bodies aren't gendered. So Zoomer knows about body parts, but penises are not boy body parts, and vaginas are not girl body parts, and as well as all the toys, et cetera. And they really try to mix it up. So they are absolutely opting out of the whole thing, and in trying to influence other people and let Zoomer just develop. And the idea is that those pressures to conform and those messages about what's for boys and what's for girls are so strong that by not revealing the sex of your child or imposing a gender identity onto a child, that's how they can most develop into their authentic self. And what I say in the book is like, that's great. That's not for everyone. So there are a lot of things that the rest of us can do to not let our children feel they must order their worlds by the pink-blue divide. And, I do one of my methods is ranting in front of my kids. Just like, this is for everyone. This is not for boys or girls. You could try the ranting. I was also trying to write a book and change the whole culture. That's a thing you can do. But yeah, I definitely talk about that style of parenting. And I think even if it doesn't catch on, I think it can help alert people to the reasons she's doing that are because of her own sociological studies about gender impacts on health. And that's what led her to want to do it.
Dave, I presume a different Dave, also probably a wonderful Dave though, is wondering what it looks like when marketers start marketing to gender nonconforming people, and what it looks like when there are new marketing categories created there, if that's positive or negative, what that's going to mean.
It looks like, every 3 months in the style section of the Times. So there are marketers trying to do some things that are outside of traditional gender, and there were some gender fluid dolls that Mattel put out. And there's always a lot of criticism. There's always like, you're doing it, no matter how radical or important the thing anyone's doing, there's just an immediate list of criticism. And I can't remember if they were non-binary or gender fluid dolls, but people were saying, oh, this is an identity and it's not about physical androgyny. It's like who you are as a person. But these were dolls that you had, they could have short hair or long hair, and you could mix and match, et cetera. What I'm talking about doesn't require any new items at all. It only requires that the stuff on the pink side of the pink-blue divide is open to boys. A great example is dolls. Nobody buys dolls for boys, or it's very rare, except they buy action figures, which are dolls with, muscly arms. And action figures were created for the boys who were secretly playing with dolls, and they had to do it secretly because they had gotten the message that they shouldn't. And that's when marketers realized, holy crap, there's a whole giant market for dolls. 50% of the population, we can sell that many more dolls if we call them action figures. And there's research from the turn of the 19th century that says like up to 89% of boys were playing with dolls. So all you have to do, well, it's a big thing. all you have to do is stand in your living room and rant that everything is for everybody. I think marketers have to like put boys on the Lego Friends boxes and put girls on the Lego, you know, machine kits, and just try to be more inclusive. And it's not about like, we need a new set of toys, because all of the things that were marked as gender neutral were just boy things that were acceptable to girls. And we've never done girl things that are acceptable to boys. So let's just stop calling them boy things and girl things and let everybody have at it.
We have so many more questions here because it's such a great topic and you are such an incredible speaker on it. So I encourage you to maybe glance at them after we're done here, because I'm just going to wrap us up. But you know, I think that there's so much more really meaningful and important discourse that we haven't had a chance to get to, which always means that you have hit something in the public conversation that people have a real hunger for and a need to talk to each other about. So I also want to recommend that in addition to buying and reading this book, all of you keep talking to each other about it. I feel like these are not conversations that we have enough, and we don't have them openly enough. And we have them, I mean, one of the great things about Lisa is she said that she's interested in questions and not answers. I think that we come at each other with answers all the time instead of questions. And I think there's something really powerful even just scrolling through these questions and seeing this topic approached in questions. And so I just want to thank you for all of your work, doing far more than just raising questions in this book and in this conversation. And I was going to pose it as a question myself, but I'm really just sort of sitting with it, which is I was going to ask you to imagine what the world looked like if we could just raise our kids to be themselves and be free and not be so saddled by this bullshit. And it just feels like the answer is, of course, like things would be a lot better in really different ways. And I think it's going to be an interesting time to watch that surface and go back and et cetera. And I just, you know, I do wonder though, as we wrap up, someone mentioned Kamala in the comments, and I feel like it's impossible this evening to be thinking about race and femininity and identity and possibility in our future without thinking a little bit about her and what she represents in our surprising history and future, as you might put it. And I was wondering if you could just frame this a little bit in terms of what we might be seeing moving forward in terms of having this Black woman who does not necessarily represent, you know, political wifery on our ticket as of this evening.
Well, I was
rather off the Democratic ticket.
My first reaction when I heard was like, President Harris sounds very reasonable. It's like a perfectly reasonable name for a president. It seems like she'd do a good job. And yesterday, my stepfather texted me and said, I wonder how many of those VP picks were tomboys and if that could be an article. So I frantically researched everyone because most great women from Dolly, you know, a lot of performers, especially famous women of all kinds, will say that they were tomboys growing up, from Janet Jackson to Dolly Parton to the first women doctors in America in the late 19th century. So I assumed that they would all have been tomboys, but I could only find evidence that Susan Rice was a tomboy. And I couldn't find any evidence that Kamala Harris had ever identified that way, but also it's, you know, as we said before, like a very white word. So, you know, I think that, we had one other, I remember when Geraldine Ferraro was the pick, and I don't think it's her fault. I think it was probably sleepy Walter Mondale's fault, but I feel like the country's quite ready for it, and that I could say the opposite considering what happened with Hillary, but she was such a polarizing figure and a tomboy. But I think it just, is really important for all those girls to see, like, yeah, that's an option. You can grow up and be that, and you don't even have to have been a tomboy.
Thank you so much. I couldn't recommend this book more to everyone, as I have been.
Thank you, Lauren, for doing this.
I'm so thrilled that it exists in the world.
Thank you.
Thank both of you. This was very illuminating. Thank you so much to Lauren and Lisa and to everyone who asked questions. If you missed the event for any reason, we'll have it on YouTube very soon. And please buy the book if you haven't already. We have the link on the event page and in the chat. And it's good for Lisa, and it helps us put on more free events too. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Lauren.
Thank you.
Thank you all the people who came.
Bye.
Bye.